Hi, my name is Jeremy. This is Red Means Recording, and I heard a rumor that you were trying to make a synthesizer sound. That's cool. I understand also that you're having a little bit of trouble figuring out what to do, how to make it sound how you want it to, what even to reach for, what's the starting point for all this. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. Today, we're going to talk about how to approach thinking about how to make a sound that you have in your head. And we're going to start off by looking at an instrument that we're all probably pretty familiar with, the piano. So I have a spectrum analyzer up in front of us right now, and what I want you to look at is what's going on in the frequencies. This actually goes up to 24 kilohertz and starts at 10 hertz. So beyond the range of human hearing, we hear from 20 to 20,000 hertz, just about. So I'm going to play a note. This is a C. You can see we have all these little ripples here, right? What's going on here? Well, take a look on the bottom left-hand corner of this spectral analyzer and see what happens when I put my mouse over this right here. See how it says C2? That's the note that I'm playing. Let me play an F. There's an F2. So this is what we call the fundamental. This is the fundamental tone of our sound. This is what we associate for the most part with the note itself. So next what I'm going to do is introduce what's called a low-pass filter. A low-pass filter is going to start taking the high frequencies off until all that we're left with is that fundamental tone right here. Let's hear what happens. Doesn't really sound much like a piano anymore, does it? I'd say certainly not. Barely recognizable as a piano anymore. We can still hear a little bit of knock, which is below our fundamental, which is part of the way that the physical piano works. But for the most part, this is kind of just a sine wave now. And you can see in our J-scope up in the upper right that it is kind of a sine wave. Look at that, just a sine wave. So what's a sine wave? It's a really smooth, pure expression of tone. There's no upper harmonics. There's nothing to help us identify any kind of like instrument, anything like that. The sine wave is also one of the fundamental wave shapes that we can choose from when starting a subtractive synthesis patch. And it's what I want us to think about when we start thinking about how to approach making a sound. Our fundamental represents the tone, the note. And as we increase the high frequency of this note, we get harmonics. That's what these are, harmonics. So there's one an octave up, there's one an octave and a perfect fifth, and then we start creating other harmonics on top. There's an order to these, and the order of these harmonics and how they present is what creates the sound. So we have fundamental tone, we have harmonics, and then we have other qualities too that we have to think about. For instance, decay and attack. Attack is how quickly the instrument occurs, how quickly the instrument sort of like comes into being. Pianos have a pretty quick attack. Depending on how long I hold the key for, they also have a long decay and a quick release, unless I have the pedal. If I just press, that's quick decay. If I hold, that's a sustain and decay. So these are things you need to think about when you're thinking about your synth sound. What are some other qualities we can identify about this piano? Well, there's sort of a percussive pluck at the beginning that's different than the rest of the sound. And if we look at the spectrum analyzer, we can see a burst of high frequency stuff up here that mellows out as the decay happens, as the sort of sound mellows out. So burst of high frequency harmonics, which is that percussive pluck. And then we start to mellow out and the harmonics start to sort of just mellow out as well. And you can hear that reflected in the sound. The point being here that when you are approaching making a sound in a synthesizer, this kind of stuff is great to keep in mind. Whether or not a sound has a sort of brightness means that it has more high harmonics. And whether or not a sound's brightness changes over time means that those harmonics are being manipulated. A piano is a pretty complex acoustic instrument. It's hard to model a piano correctly, which is why samples generally are good for something like this. Let's take a look at a different kind of instrument real quick. Here we have a multi-sampled string. Let's go ahead and zero out our EQ and take a look at what's happening from a frequency perspective. I'm currently playing the same C note that I was playing on the piano. Here's our fundamental. You can see it fluctuating a lot more. And we have the same order of harmonics so far. C, G, C, E, G, and then we go to A sharp. So far, the harmonics mirror of that of the piano, which is kind of interesting to think about. But this sound has a different quality of attack and sustain and decay. This one has a longer attack. From a timbre perspective, we don't get the same decay of high-frequency harmonics with this string sound. In fact, it's present throughout, that sort of high buzziness. And I can actually bring that even more by increasing the brightness of this sound. Which doesn't sound very good. So, these are the same controls that we have over our synthesizers. Let's take a look at one more sound, shall we? The next sound on the table is an electric bass. Here's our fundamental. We have a different harmonic profile. We have a buildup of harmonics here. Let's see if they follow the same path. C, G, C, E, G, and A sharp. They do. That's kind of interesting. But the reason I'm showing you this is because bass isn't just bass sometimes. Look at all this information up here. If this was just bass, it wouldn't sound anything like a bass. That's just a sine wave, baby. Well, kind of. A little folded, a little different. But that's mostly just a sine wave. Oh, there we go. Everything becomes sine waves if you believe. So, sounds are a combination of our fundamental tone, our root note, so to speak, of that frequency, and then harmonics. So when you're thinking about making a sound, you got to think about your brightness, your harmonics, your attack and release characteristics, and we're going to dive into that now. So when you're faced with a synthesizer like this, which is both a virtual analog and a wavetable synthesizer, we're going to be focusing on the wavetable portion of it, we have access to wave shapes. This is the first thing you want to think about. So a sine wave, as we've determined, is a pure expression of tone. There is no upper harmonics to this. That means that something like a filter, which is going to be a big part of our sound shaping, won't really do anything until we reach a point that we dig into that fundamental tone, and at that point it goes away. Because as you can see, based on the frequencies here, the filter frequency that we have currently at 20,000 hertz, we're going to reach a point that this cuts off that fundamental tone and it goes away. So, what are sine waves good for? Well, sine waves are good for bass. Listen to that pure sub bass. That's nice, right? So sine waves really, really good for bass, really, really good for adding bass to things if we have more than one sound going on and the other sound is sort of like a more high frequency, high harmonic content. Next up in our little litany of basic wave shapes is a triangle. So this is a little sharper than our other friend. See, there's our smooth friend. There's our triangle friend. And what do we get? We get a little bit of extra upper harmonics. Little tiny bit, and we can hear the filter working on it if we start bringing this down. All right, cool. So what's a triangle good for? Well, again, pretty good for bass. Triangle's also good for soft leads. Next up is our friend, the saw wave. Saw wave is going to be big and bright and brash and brassy. The saw wave and the square wave, which we're going to get into next, are going to be what you want to reach for when you want something to have some form of high harmonic to it, which also gives something for the filter to dig onto. Let's listen to what happens when we bring the filter down on this. A low-pass filter interacting with a high harmonic content wave is one of the fundamental sort of sounds of synthesis in general. And if you look at some of the more classic synthesizers, like the Juno 106 and something like that, you're dealing with these basic wave shapes and a low-pass filter. sometimes a high pass filter too. So what's a saw good for? Well, all kinds of stuff. It's good for leads. It's good for some of buzzy basses. And it's good for keys, especially with a little bit of unison. It's also the basis of what's called a super saw, which is a very popular sort of sound. When you take something like a saw wave and you turn the frequency way down on it, you can still hear a little bit of that buzziness. And if we go back to a sine wave, you'll hear the difference. Completely smooth, whereas this just has a little bit of grit to it. Let's go up to the square wave. Square waves make great basses. They're huge in the sub-range. They also make great leads. They have a bit hollower, more like upfront quality than a saw. I'd call a saw sort of nasally, whereas a square is just kind of burly. So good for basses, good for keys. We're going to get into keys with them in a bit, and good for leads if you want something with a high harmonic content. So we're going to let's go ahead and execute on some of this stuff. So the first thing you want to think about when you're trying to make a sound is how much high frequency content do I want? How much high harmonic content do I want? Is this sound going to be buzzy? Is it going to be brash? And then the next thing you want to think about is what's the volume shape of this sound? So in piano, we determined that the piano generally has a pretty quick attack followed by a rather quick decay. You could have a long sustain and a long release depending on how you are holding down a pedal and holding down the keys. And the same can be said for pressing it very quickly and letting go. So a bass has a very quick attack followed by a sustain and release, and strings have a long attack and a long release depending on how they're set up. So that means that the next thing I would want to reach for here is my volume envelope. This is an example of something I would call a pad, sort of a pad shape, long attack, long release, very dreamy. I make a lot of pads. What does this sound like with a saw wave? Very different experience. Very sort of classic synth string sound. What about a square wave? Muscular. Let's go back to our triangle wave and let's experiment with a different attack release characteristic. Here is a quick attack, quick decay, long release. It's a bit more like a keyboard, isn't it? A bit more like sort of a, almost like a piano. Let's tighten up that release a little bit. Cool. Let's check it with a square wave. So you can hear that like just a waveform plus volume envelope is going to start being evocative of the kind of sound that you're trying to create. One thing to consider when you're doing this is whether or not a sound is inherently monophonic or not. So that means that a piano is going to be something that generally has chords involved, right? Like you're going to play with more than one note, generally. But you know, you can have some solo stuff too. A bass is generally played one note at a time, which means it's monophonic as opposed to polyphonic. And this makes a difference in how the sound is played. So let me show you this real quick. This is probably something I would try to dial in at this stage. If I wanted to make a bass, I would go over to my keyboard and I would change this from poly to monophonic. Now, whenever I press a key, I'm only going to get one note. I can't play more than one note at once. And the volume envelope, or the envelope itself, re-triggers every single time I play a note. There's another version of monophonic called legato, where if you play two notes next to each other without letting up the key, the volume envelope or the other envelopes that you might have working do not retrigger. This is great for leads and in some case basses. In this case, I'm going to leave it on legato so we can hear this as we work through filtering. This is the next step. So if I wanted to make a big bass, I would probably want something with high harmonic content, like a square wave to start. I want to start introducing some of that harmonic shift that we saw in our earlier activities when we were looking at the spectral analyzer, right? Our filter is going to do that for us. So what I'm going to do, because I want this to decay over time, is I'm going to grab this envelope here and I'm going to assign it to my filter because I want it to affect my filter. Because what we saw in our other activities was that there is a decay over time of our high frequency content. Now this filter is creating high frequency content, high harmonic content at the start, and quickly decaying down. In some cases, it sounds rather percussive. Longer, it's going to sound different. So now we have something shaping our volume, and we have something shaping our high harmonic content to give us a plucky sound, which is great for bass. Get that percussive sort of thing. This burst of high frequency content, this burst of high harmonic content, is not dissimilar to the burst of inharmonic content we hear when we hear like a hammer strike something like on a piano, or the pick hit a string on a bass. It's nowhere near as complex as that content is in an acoustic sound, but you know, we're not doing FM synthesis, we're doing subtractive right now, so it is what it is. Sometimes you have to think about things in an abstract sort of way to get where you want. So I want to show off that legato mode a bit more. I would choose legato mode if I wanted any kind of interesting slide, and this is mostly for leads. So let's go ahead and take our decay really long. Listen to what happens when I play one note. Now listen to what happens when I play one note held down and play some other notes. See how that filter is now over time decaying as opposed to every single time I press a key. That's the magic of legato mode. So we made a bass, pretty simple bass. Does that make sense? I thought about how much high frequency content and how much bass content I might want. I picked the appropriate waveform for it. I shaped my volume. I shaped my envelope that went to my filter because I knew I wanted a burst of high frequency noise, and then I wanted it to mellow out. So what if I wanted to make like a keyboard sound? Well, I need to go back here and I would need to change this to polyphonic again. Now let's see what happens when I play this sound as a key sound. Well, that's not really that good, is it? It's very like plucky and there's no real sound to it. Works for a monophonic sound, but not for a keyboard sound. So what I would need to do is give myself a little bit more high frequency content, a little bit more of those upper harmonics. We're almost there. What I'm going to do is adjust how much the filter is being affected by the envelope. Let's try this with a saw wave. So in this case, I think a saw wave is a bit more appropriate for the keyboard sound that I want because it's not quite so bassy. Wow, I'm such a great keyboard player. So what does a keyboard sound look like? Well, we have that same envelope that we had before. We have a different envelope on our filter. But we are thinking about piano. We're thinking about how keyboards work, and that's important. By adding a little bit of attack to this, we are approaching more almost of a brass sound, because brass has a little bit of blat to it in the beginning, a little bit of attack. Let's listen to what this sounds like. Do you hear that? A little bit of blat. If we add more to this, we're going to get a sort of a sci-fi sound. Let's add some reverb to this, shall we? This is a great opportunity to talk about the sustain of your sound. Let's go back to our envelope here. Right now, my sustain for my filter is pretty high. I want this sound to sort of disappear a bit more. So I'm going to go like this. And now I can play it differently. It's wonderful. So we've determined that our waveform, our envelope for volume, and our envelope for our filter, and our choice of filter have a big effect on what we're going to get out of this. Let's talk about other filter types real quick, okay? So a low-pass filter lets the lows pass through, and we can see that as evidenced by the way that this looks. Think of this as an EQ curve, right? We have a couple other different types of filters. Why would you reach for a different type of filter? Well, here's a high-pass filter. So a high-pass filter, as you might expect, allows highs to pass as opposed to the lows. And this can give you all of the high-frequency content, which means very, very bright and kind of presents as like a very bright sort of string sound. I would never use this for bass, but it's really useful to use as sort of an EQ or as something to direct the energy of your sound up higher. Let's hear what it sounds like on a triangle. Very mellow, very cool, right? Because the triangle doesn't have the level of upper harmonics, it presents as a lot more mellow than a saw wave or a square wave when it comes to using a high-pass filter. Let's talk about bandpass. Bandpass allows only a band to pass through, a middle band right here. Up here it's a high pass, down here it's a low pass. Bandpasses are great for creating cool movement throughout your piece. So I wouldn't use one on its own completely unless I was trying to make some kind of really techie lead. But they have a very techie kind of sound, and when combined with other filters, they can almost sound phaser-esque. So let's go ahead and give that a try real quick. Pretty cool sound, right? So that was a little bit advanced, using two separate filters to get a particular sound. We use the second filter to use the low pass setting that we used before to give us that sort of pluck and a little bit of bass, and we use the bandpass filter to give us that cool techie sound on top. When you're building your sound, you're going to think about your fundamental waveform, and then you're going to think about your filter as well. How is your filter going to interact with that waveform? You know, like, is it going to accentuate the highs? Is it going to subtract from the highs with some kind of envelope or some kind of LFO? What are you trying to achieve here? What kind of sound are you trying to achieve? The concept of movement in a sound is inherent to a lot of acoustic sounds. And there's always a sort of a shifting timbre, sort of slight detuning to a lot of things, especially when we talk about ensemble sounds. So let's talk about tuning real quick. Does your sound need a little bit of variable pitch? Leads like to do this in some cases. So let me show you how to do that. I'm going to grab this LFO and I'm going to assign it to my fine frequency. You can see on our scope that we got a little bit of funk. You can also see up here that we're doing this little wheel right here. What you can do is go into here and assign this to something like a mod wheel. And you can turn it all the way up and go like this. And now when I turn up the mod wheel, pitch variation is not just for the funk. It's also just to create sort of a more unstable organic feeling to your patches. Here's a simple 3 oscillator analog setup in Pigments where we have access to 3 separate oscillators with the basic wave shapes that we were dealing with before. Here's a saw wave. Here's a slightly detuned saw wave. Hear how we're getting that sort of swimming pitch? Let's bring in the third. Before. After. So when you think about instruments in the real world, when a bunch of strings are playing at once, they're not going to have perfect tuning, and the room is going to throw those pitches around and make them sound a little bit wobbly. And so we can do that here. That's what we just did. We have these detuned a little bit. But pitch variations generally aren't 100% static. So we can assign an LFO to each one of these and have them move around. Before, after. It also sounds good on triangles, by the way. So when you're building your sound, ask yourself whether or not you want to have things sort of emulate multiple unstable pitch sources, and whether or not you want to just detune them by turning on their semitones off a little bit, or use an LFO to have that wobble around. You're going to get what's called sort of an ensemble effect, which leads to an absolutely massive sound, as you can hear. With all this in mind, when should you reach for a wavetable? What is even a wavetable? Well, we've been working with the wavetable here with this 4 basic wave shape things, but wavetables are usually associated with crazy sounds, like these crazy hard sounds, the crazy like robot sounds. Here's an example of a wavetable. We've been looking at spectral analysis and wave shapes a lot, and at this point, hopefully you understand that a sine wave is a very pure expression of tone with no upper harmonics. Wavetables, on the other hand, are these kinky motherfuckers. Look at this kinky guy. All those kinks add up to a very interesting experience. Now, this kind of math that we're seeing here, this kind of crazy stuff, is possible via synthesis. It would just take a shit ton of stuff to even get to the point where we could have this wavetable. So you can think of wavetables as like, okay, well, basic wave shapes aren't weird enough. I need to go further. I need to take this further and further into an extremely crazy harmonic realm. And the reason I would reach for a wavetable is sometimes I don't even need a filter on these. I can just modulate this wavetable and get an interesting sound. So let's do that real quick. I'm going to go to envelope 2. And I'm going to modulate this wavetable with envelope 2. In case you haven't quite figured it out yet, I really like to play wavetables super low in the octave range, because up here, while it does sound cool, it doesn't give me any of that sort of hard growl. This wavetable sounds like it's been passed through like multiple stages of distortion. It's a very complex sound, and that's cool. That's why you should reach for a wavetable, because they represent a collection of crazy sort of like math choices that have led to a very complex series of waves, a table of waves that you can use as an audio source to create a very complex sound from the get-go. And sometimes you don't need anything else. To say wavetables can get nasty is an understatement, friends. And I have not added anything else to this. So don't be scared to just reach for a wavetable and see if it rips your face off, because that's what we really want. Now, do wavetables sound good as, like, you know, not insane? Yeah, they do. So depending on what the original wave shape is and how you pass it through filters and shape it, you will get more mellow kind of results. You can see the wave shape that we're dealing with here, which is doing a fun little dance, is somewhere between a sine and a triangle. So we're going to get a more mellow sound, but it's going to be more interesting because of the way that the wavetable is able to move through processed versions of the wave and bend it around and stuff. We're able to get source oscillators that we would never have in our basic analog wave shapes. I think I've talked enough for this video. I hope I didn't lose the plot with you talking about how to do this, but let's TLDR real quick. Instruments in the real world have an inherent tone to them, which is usually their fundamental frequency, followed by a series of harmonics that help define the timbre of the tone itself and help us identify what that sound is. That fundamental tone can be reduced to a sine wave, and sine waves can be used to give us wonderful bass sounds and fundamental note sound, but they don't have any harmonics for us to create interest or brightness or anything for like a filter to grab onto. So when you're thinking about your sound, the first thing you want to think about is how much upper harmonics do I want? And then pick a wave shape that's appropriate for that. Triangle is going to give you a little buzz. It's still going to be mellow. Saw is going to be a little bit brash and brassy, but not as full as like a square wave when it comes to its power in the mix. Next, you're going to want to think about your keyboard mode, whether or not your sound is monophonic or polyphonic. Leads and basses are good generally as monophonic or legato. Your keyboard sounds and everything else should be polyphonic probably. Now let's adjust our volume envelope so that we can have either a pad-like envelope or something with a bit more percussive. Now let's think about what we want to do to the sound from a filter perspective. Do we want to take some of that high frequency stuff and filter it over time or completely? If we want to use something that takes off high frequencies, let's use a low pass filter, and let's figure out whether or not we want to use an envelope to affect it. If we want something to be more focused up in the high frequencies, let's use a high pass filter. If we want something that has a quality of both, either use a bandpass or combine it with another filter. Adjust the envelope or whatever modulation you have going to that to your taste and to match the kind of instrument that you're trying to create. Think about acoustic instruments while you're doing it and how they decay and shape over time. If you're in the mood to get spicy, grab a wavetable. They're going to be high harmonic content. You might not even need to use a filter, but you definitely are going to want to modulate their position in some way. I hope this exercise has helped you maybe be able to think about how to visualize your sounds a little bit easier when you're sitting down to make a sound, and that your sound design starts to become a little bit more natural for you. Thanks for watching. My name is Jeremy. This is Red Means Recording, and I hope you have a wonderful day.